This week, for my boosting of the National Park Service, I'm actually going to tell you about an event. Many parks have these, but this one slots in so neatly with everything I'm doing right now. Right down to the iron stoves, it's the one I chose. It's Living History Day on Saturday, June 22nd at the Allegheny Portage Railroad. Located in central Pennsylvania, near the town of Gallatin, this site is a way to peek into the many rapid and life and culture-changing innovations that are happening in the first half of the 19th century. And the Living History Day this summer, June 22nd, is a perfect chance to go out and see what is going on. There was a shift from homespun fabrics to machine-made fabric. Dyeing cloth was changing from natural to synthetic dyes. Cookery was moving out of fireplaces and onto cook stoves. The introduction of glass jars for home food preservation and the national transportation system was just getting started. You can see there some of the earliest railroads. They were making hand-hewn stone sleepers, the things that we think of as railroad ties. So many of these changes are critical to the growth of the America we know. And Allegheny Portage Railroad gives you a chance to see all this and other early 19th century innovations in transport and daily life. So even if you can't make the Living History Day, head to central Pennsylvania, both for the history and really because it's a beautiful part of the country. Episode 115, Iron. Let's get cooking. Hello, and welcome to the History of American Food. This week, I'll be looking at a huge change in how America cooks and how it gets around and how it makes things. Up until now, iron was filling the role that it had for many hundreds of years, mostly as weapons, tools, and pots. But that is all about to change as humans start to understand and, more importantly, effectively harness pressure. And iron has roles in both the cause side and the effect side. To unwind what I mean by that, pull up to your place at the table and let's dig in. The first thing you need to know is that without calculus, from both Isaac Newton and Gottfried Wilhelm Leibniz, the steam age as we know it doesn't happen. They made it possible to efficiently work with curves, both in vessels, barrels, pressure vessels, boats, all that, and in graphs and measuring things like pressure, speed, temperature, and how they change. Without a good way to work with curves in all things, so much in the modern world that we take for granted could not have been developed because it would have been so cumbersome to measure, predict, and communicate. So that's right, without calculus, there's no drive-through espresso. Lots of other stuff too, but since I'm in the process of moving right now, picking up food with my car that other people have made is on the brain right now. But seriously, the 18th century development of a mathematical system to talk about curves efficiently made it possible to develop pressure vessels in a systematic way. That is, canisters that could either hold air squished to higher pressure than the outside atmosphere, or air pulled to be at a lower pressure than the outside air. And by controlling the pressure of air in this way, it was possible to make engines go using heat instead of just transferred force of, say, wind or water or oxen. Water wheels, windmills, treadmills, and other wheels attached to a direct force were the first application of gears and the redirection of vectors of force. Think about a river. It runs in a direction, downstream. But by putting that single directional force to a water wheel, the force now makes something go around a wheel, a saw blade, a grindstone. Using gears and a clutch mechanism, the force can be attached and detached from the wheel. And gears with greater and fewer numbers of teeth, that can change the torque, a form of pressure, applied to the wheel. And then gear size and number of teeth can also change the speed. So a water wheel and a grindstone might not spin at the same rate. Gears connecting the two can make it so the grindstone spins around more than once each time a water wheel goes around, or fewer times. Understanding the math of this and how it all applies, incidentally, is still essential in getting the joints and robot limbs to do what you want. both in terms of how far they move and with a given amount of power and the force they apply. But the second part, finding a way to store and release energy so you don't have to find a cooperative donkey or gust of wind or handy watercourse, is really at the base of the steam age, and then being able to contain and direct that energy. The first form of stored energy regularly used in the steam age was wood and other plant matter, and wood really is the energy of the sun trapped in a matrix made from air and water. Peat is slightly aged plant matter, and coal is more vigorously aged plant and animal matter that could also be used. Burned under vessels of water, the resulting steam was collected in other vessels that could stand large changes in pressure. And it turned out the best vessel were rounded metal containers. The first version were spheres. Then it was discovered that cylinders with hemispherical ends worked just as well and were far easier to make in larger sizes. Now, if you're wondering what I'm talking about, look at any handy, say, propane tank or other tank used for transporting gases. The shape allows the inside and the outside pressures to be wildly different. And from there, an assortment of pressure-activated valves would allow pressurized gases to move about a system in controlled ways. Now, the first practical application was to direct heated air and water vapor from the aforementioned steam across a propeller of sorts that would move an arm that would work some sort of pump. And aside, people got pumps to work before they understood what pressure was and how it worked, and this was because they were working with small pressure differences that could be manipulated with muscle power. And the duration the pressure differences had to be held didn't require extremely water or airtight materials. Anyway, it was in the 19th century that pressure differentials started to be harnessed efficiently beyond the labs and workshops of rich, eccentric weirdos. The resulting steam engines were first commercially used to pump water out of mines, but soon they were running mills, and from there the engines were put on wheels to move vehicles themselves. And here, math, and especially calculus, was essential for calculating the power that could be provided from a vessel of given size, heating water to a given heat. Amounts of fuel, power provided, and how far it could drive a given train could then be calculated. And how much power and thus how much fuel needed to pull a given load was something people could start to figure out. And now we have invented modern calculations of freight costs. You're welcome. And it was these calculable, predictable steam locomotives, the choo-choo trains of history and legend, and the iron rails they ran on that were about to change America. From a bunch of loosely connected polities with an unusually busy national flag to one connected nation. This is all, admittedly, a highly simplified version of how steam pumps and engines work, but come on, I'm trying to get back to food here. What it really meant in the transport and factory powering game is that you could feed men and donkeys to haul wood and coal to your railroad or factory. And then you could use the wood and coal when you wanted them, not when the men and donkeys were awake or rested. After all, any one donkey can only work and pull things for so long, and you'd have to bring along its food. But with wood, and especially coal, all that donkey power is in a much more compact and efficient package. You're just bringing along the power, and you don't need the donkey, which needs rest and food. You just have the power, and the engine to harness it. This means the calculations have just all changed. The tyranny of donkey or oxen or mule or horse or whatever power is gearing up to be left behind. Though to be fair, we are still a nation in love with the horse, so steam power is talked about in units of horsepower. So using wood, charcoal, and coal, steam could be made, captured in iron vessels and directed to turn iron engines, drive iron gears, and transfer power. And one place besides driving these locomotive steam engines that this power went was into the refining of iron and turning out iron plates. The refined iron, pounded by these newfangled steam hammers, children of the water hammers of the 18th century, could be made into the harder, more flexible, and far more durable wrought iron. it could stand up to more force, provide more force, and not be in danger of cracking or shattering. The result? Better axes, better saw blades, and other iron tools and parts. And this is going to revolutionize American building and shipping. But wait for wood, we'll get there. The big one was making iron that was suited to both shaping and to better casting. And those cast parts, for one, ended up as plates for stoves and even better cookware. The forebears to our modern cast iron cookware has its roots in this better refined iron of the 19th century. Things like sugaring cauldrons, bake kettles, firebacks, and plate stoves from this era are around, and even some are in use because the crystals that were formed in the wrought iron used to make them have a more favorable combination of silica slag, carbon, and iron. This combination and longer crystal structure make them more resistant to rust, to shattering, and general degradation. That's right. Iron and steam power was used to make better iron that could make iron that was better for other things. It's like a big iron Ouroboros. Making better iron made things that were better. It's more sophisticated iron would result, and round and round. A particularly important iron industrial product of the age were cauldrons. Say, sugaring cauldrons and other cauldrons of the era were large, round items that were placed over fires, flames, or beds of charcoal coals, depending on the desired product. But generally, these larger, round vessels were made possible because they could be pounded or wrought into shape instead of just being cast. That meant they were good for a much larger number of heat-cool cycles before suffering a failure. And because they were worked metal instead of just cast, they could be larger without being as heavy as simply cast items would have been. So in large-scale food production, and whale oil production for that matter, this meant larger iron vessels that weighed less and had to be replaced less often under hard use were now available, which in turn made all manner of things cheaper: sugar, molasses, distilled liquors, and of course rendered fats for both lighting and eating purposes. This incidentally will make soap cheaper and more widely available in the near future as well. So stick with me. But it wasn't just all about making better items for industrial production. The home cook was also benefiting by the change. Bake kettles were more available. These are the enclosed, flat-bottom, lidded things generally called by modern Americans Dutch ovens. But they had two particular attributes that make them not that. First, they had 3 legs to hold them up over a bed of coals. In other words, they'd be no good on a stove burner, gas, electric, or induction. But in a fireplace, they were perfect, perched up above that little bed of coals. And then they have a lid with a raised edge. And this allowed more coals to be placed atop the kettle. And all of that meant you could bake bread even if you didn't have one of those huge brick or earthen ovens that you had to heat up for hours and then dedicate an entire day to the baking. Especially with the advent of things like baking powders and other things called chemical yeasts. As a result, biscuits and pies and things like coffee cake could be purpose-baked on the day they were used. Sure, baking day still existed, but its foundations were profoundly shaken. And those taking to the road and the wilderness, they had a way to bake foods while traveling. I mean, it was no longer just all rabbits on spits. Now here's a fun fact. A layer of coals on the bottom and one on top of these bake kettles creates a space that hits just about at 350 degrees Fahrenheit or 180 degrees C, which is why all of our baking recipes seem to call for that temperature. It's the temperature we've been baking at for a very long time. Earthwood seems to make coals that create that temperature range, and so it means it's one of those questions right up there with why is the sky blue? And the answer is the physics of the materials that make up our sun and planet Earth make it that way. Anyway, moving on from philosophically challenging aspects of the natural sciences, let's get back to fire and iron. Firebacks are large iron plates that were placed in the back of cooking and heating fireplaces to work as a sort of storage radiator. The heat from the fire would be absorbed slowly and then released slowly by this slab of metal. The result was to create a more even cooking environment and put more heat from the fire back in the house. Just like many things being made at the time, they would get more decorative. They could be molded to depict leaves and fruit and flowers, family crests, and even religious scenes. My visit to Fonthill Castle in Doylestown, Pennsylvania last year treated me to a display of hundreds of these, and a depiction of the Last Supper seemed to be very popular. All I could think about was the person who had the job to regularly clean the fireplaces and spent who knows how much time scrubbing soot out of every nook and cranny of these relief sculptures. Oof. Of course, it's one thing to have a fire in a fireplace, with much of the heat going into the walls of the fireplace and up the large chimney hole. But what if a metal box could be built to work as a fire box, and then all that heat could go out into the room? And this was the innovation that became plate stoves. Back in my last season when I visited the Hopewell Forge, I got to see how these worked. Now, Hopewell wasn't using a steam hammer. They had a water wheel to run a bellows and a hammer to refine the iron to specifications, but this iron was poured into sand molds to make iron plates that would fit together to build fireboxes that would stand up on legs. So little primitive radiators, sending heat out from the fire built inside. And these earliest radiators, these plate stoves, would develop in all sorts of directions. The fanciest will be parlor stoves, which will end up being enameled and shaped into fanciful curves, and some will even be formed into the shapes of castles. More practical ones will be used to heat homes, schoolhouses, and offices. Let's take a moment to think of poor Bob Cratchit begging for just a bit of extra coal to melt his ink. Radiator stoves of the era are often identified by the number of plates they're built out of, so 7-plate stoves, 9-plate stoves, 10 plates, and so on. That's nice, but the item we really care about now are the cook stoves, and being able to more easily produce iron plates will make iron cook stoves more available to more of America. And it absolutely, entirely changes how the country cooks. The first two big changes an iron stove brings to American cookery is that first, much less fuel is necessary, and second, it is much, much, much less dangerous. The top of the stove is a sturdy, flat surface. Pots and skillets and grates are no longer propped over little piles of coal that a cook has to walk around and dodge. Cauldrons of hot liquids or fats are no longer hanging from poles that could break and spill all over a hapless cook. And skirts are no longer in danger of catching fire from stray coals or dodging between coal pile and coal pile that are used as burners in the cook fireplace. Oh, and the amount of smoke a cook has to inhale goes way down, along with the bending and standing and bending and standing and lifting. Just reduces by so much. And because the fire is contained in a metal box, keeping a small pile of coals overnight just got much easier and much less risky. Hot breakfast all of a sudden is available to more people. That hot bowl of porridge, more attainable. And honestly, what would you rather have? That slab of cold solidified porridge in the morning or a hot bowl of it? And now, possibly with a cup of tea or some hot milk, the iron stove is more responsible for the hot morning beverage for regular people than just about anything else. Home canning is also developed in this age, and the iron stove, with its ability to have a large, flat-bottom pot on top of it, makes home canning in glass jars more accessible than the potting in ceramic jars that had come before. And yes, when I get there, I'll explain why we call it canning even though we use glass jars. And along with cooks being in less danger of dying by, catching on fire or horrible scaldings, the other big change with the advent of the stove was the idea of cooking underway. Up until iron stoves, cooking on board a ship had been a tricky business and just about always meant stew. On a ship, a cook would build a brick fire pit and hang a cauldron over it. And this sounds like a terrible idea on a boat made of wood and sealed with flammable stuff like hemp rope soaked in pitch. But with iron stoves, just as with home cooks, a ship's cook had an iron box to keep the fire in. And this changed the game so much that the U.S.'s tiny Navy took to retrofitting its ship's galleys with stoves pretty quickly. Even at the end of the 18th century, when it was building new ships, including its longest-serving one, they put in iron stoves as soon as they could, even if they had to buy them from England. The USS Constitution, as a new ship, was outfitted with one of these new iron stoves and retrofitted with a more advanced iron stove in time for the War of 1812. But this was done as fast as it was done because iron stoves on ships made them safer and more favorable for travel since the food got better. It just wasn't all stew or cold stew. Now bread could be baked on a boat. Sometimes. And of course, back to our boilers and steam engines, steam-powered ships that can sail or travel to a predictable schedule are on the horizon. Can you imagine what that's going to do for food? Food from around the world is going to be available to a normal person, not just the rich people? Does that even make sense? Well, while you ponder that, I'll be brewing up the next episode where I talk about sugar in the 19th century and how it gets cheaper and what it does to 19th century America to be more or less awash in sugar, especially compared to the past where sugar was rare, restricted to use by rich people or just on the most special of days. Oh, and the 19th century is when sugar that is not from sugarcane starts to enter the scene. So join me next time when corn and beets get to have their first say in the sugar landscape. Thanks for listening. Any email, questions, or quibbles will continue to reach me at thehistoryofamericanfood@gmail.com. Downloading the episode helps me know you are out there, but even better than that are your reviews. Let more people know you're listening and enjoying the show, or at least find it interesting. Want more food and history in your future? Well, I continue to do a deep dive into the 19th century with co-host Jamie Lewis of Plague of Strength in a much looser and rather wilder podcast, Prize Fighters, Circus Freaks, and Gangsters. Still food, but now fashion, fighting, and fraud. And many other F's as we go along. So that means, unlike this one, not a podcast that's E for everyone. Music for this podcast is Fingerlympics by Dr. Turtle, and you can find me on Threads and Insta, and generally around the internet as @THOA Food, and all this info is available in the show description.